As always, the question of knowing or understanding, grasping or comprehending where one ought or not, from where one can or does begin, poses itself. And the beginning of otherwise than being or beyond essence could not escape this question, which consequently resonates throughout Levinas's writing and affects thereby the entire itinerary of this work. It is precisely in the itinerary of otherwise than being or beyond essence, after marking how the interrogation on that which is presupposed and assumed in an arche, an instant or a point, according to which law such presuppositions or assumptions can be justified, is always at once posed, exposed, deployed, and subsumed, integrated, appropriated, or comprehended in and within philosophical thinking itself, that Levinas urges once more, urges on, as if still unresolved, unsettled, disquieted by this very tradition, which from Descartes' Archimedean point, ego cogito, ego sum, on which all certainty and validity can and must be founded, to Hegel's immediate consciousness already residing in absolute knowledge, to Heidegger's Dasein, always engaged in the opening of being, from Kant's synthetic apperception to Husserl's incessant genealogical search for an absolute origin of thinking by and through an interminable, and I'm quoting Levinas, methodological staying where it is, piétinement. This very tradition has always, in a certain sense, predetermined the beginning of philosophical thinking from its resolution. The question by its elucidation, clarification, explication. Well, Levinas urges once more, urges again in the itinerary, a fine risk is always something to be taken in philosophy. So a type of rupture, a type of escape from the totality of philosophical thinking. Certainly this fine risk to which we will return has always been implied in the history of philosophy and is indissociable from philosophical beginnings, even in those oeuvres which have already secured themselves, retained and protected themselves by and through the optimism, as Levinas calls it, of the Hegelian absolute or of the Heideggerian parousia of being, which both in their respective and different manners incorporate their beginning point within the very elucidation, which remains inseparable from an exhibition, a demonstration, a presentation, or a manifestation of their already determined truth and meaning. But here, and as Levinas casts his gaze on the history of philosophy as the history of the same, and thus on what has remained not only unthought or forgotten in the becoming of this history, but rather on who has been at once left over, at once in excess and foreclosed, implied or supposed, and yet also betrayed as an unthinkable throughout this very history. Here at the opening of Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence, the fine risk philosophy must take traces towards another orientation, beyond invitation and wholly exposed to a singular visitation, another orientation which thus, I quote Levinas, sketches a different structure, a structure opening to another approach, that of an anarche, of a beginlessness, where and before which the assembling of being fails. Its essence is undone in a saying beyond being and its time, and in the diachrony of transcendence, which, I quote, is not convertible into immanence, and from which, I quote again, the impossibility of thematization could be due to the goodness of the diachronical. Without principle and without beginning, Levinas engages thinking to a return to an irrecuperable past, that is a past which has never been present, never been consigned to a past present, or present that has passed into a past, an immemorial, before and irreducible to any origin or source, and where a linear regressive movement, a retrospective back along the temporal series towards a very remote past would never be able to reach the absolutely diachronous pre-original, which cannot be recuperated by memory and history. In the wake of this immemorial past, And we are yet again to see the diachronic movement at work in Levinas's writing, both, I quote, prior to every memory and ulterior to every accomplishment. I quote again, prior to and beyond essence, and in which, I quote, is situated the null site, le non-lieu of subjectivity, where the privilege of the question where no longer holds, and, I quote again, inwardness is invested in the form of a despite me for another, a signification par excellence. Levinas will insist repeatedly, that is, consequently, that it is here and in this non-lieu where, I quote, it is the very fact of finding oneself whilst losing oneself that lies the exceptionality of the self, which is why, I quote, ordered toward the face of the other, and where the order that orders me to the other does not show itself to me, save through the trace of its reclusion as a face of a neighbor, and where there is the trace of a withdrawal with which no actuality had preceded, and which becomes present only in my own voice, already obedient in the harsh present of offerings and gifts, that, I quote, all the negative attributes which state what is beyond the essence become positive in responsibility, a response answering to a non-thematizable provocation, and thus a non-vocation, a trauma. I close the quote. In and through this exception is engaged a passivity, more passive than all passivity, as the one for the other, which transcends essence understood as potency and act. I close the quotation. Clearly dislocating and undermining the Aristotelian distinction between actuality and potentiality, action and potency, Levinas thinks towards that which precedes actuality, and where this antecedence is never appropriable within the order of possibility, nor simply expropriated in a contrary trope of impossibility. Indeed, Levinas spurs on thinking freed from binarism, as Jean Bensusan was saying earlier, a thinking liberated from the traditional ontological determinations of possibility, actuality, whilst also never reverting or settling for a principled impossibility. Neither possibility nor impossibility, neither representation nor irrepresentability, neither activity nor passivity, Levinas seeks an opening wholly other than what has in ontology, and through the determinations and the categorizations, the distinctions and the correspondences of ontology, been constituted or instituted throughout its history. In other words, Levinas seeks both a before and a beyond the contradictory tropes and counter-significant figures of any and all ontological determinations. In this sense, Levinas seeks an approach, and this word is going to be very important to me, approach, because I'm going to try and show that the question of sacrifice is understood in Levinas as approach. Approach as insatiable excess, wholly other, which operates otherwise and through oppositions, opening towards an irreducible focus, un foyer, irreducible focus of signification, and by extension to a temporality, diachrony, wholly other than that constituted through the binarity of remembrance and provision, retention and protension, irreducible thus to the gathering and the synchrony of presence, always capable of reappropriating its other, absence in its breath. Towards which heading can such an exceptional and wholly other, irreducible focus of signification lead? Towards nothing less than three novel loci, three novel places. And I'm going to borrow from Rosenzweig: creation, revelation, redemption, heterogeneous and heteronymous to the three orders which have constituted and instituted the history of ontology: being, être, ought to be, devoir être, maybe, peut-être, and which we will deploy following Levinas through what we would here call a logic of the without. And it's very interesting to see throughout the otherwising being this logic of the without, du sans, saying without the said, a logic which does not preclude or exclude conjunction or concurrence, but rather which operates diachronically, that is, always before and beyond the binarity or the oppositions, and thus by and through this leap outside the inframings of the dialectical reconciliation of differences, or the turn of the ontological difference, before and beyond identity and difference, exceeding and engaging a non-indifference, that is a response as responsibility, always more than what it can or does, always more than what can be contained in its actuality or possibility. Without transition, forgive me, these three novel loci of signification, which certainly Levinas retrieves from Rosenzweig, each contain specific deployments in otherwise than being or beyond essence. And this is my extrapolation. Creation, I'm going to try and analyze this motif of creation as the loci of signification for substitution as expiation. That is what Levinas understands as sacrifice without reserve. A sacrifice without, or gratuity of sacrifice. Revelation, I'm going to try and interrogate it and interpret it as the interruption of sacrifice, and thus as the witnessing of the interruption of this gratuity of sacrifice through the witnessing of iléité, and redemption as prophetism, that is, as the idea of justice, which maintains a type of surveillance, as Sergio Labate was saying yesterday, a type of surveillance over this interruption of sacrifice. So the first of these, creation, marks and signifies, according to this interpretation of this reading, substitution as expiation. In which sense? What is substitution as expiation? And Levinas, as you know, constantly said substitution, expiation, even synonymizing the two. How and why can substitution be correlative of expiation? And in which manner does this diachrony affect the question of forgiveness, which is throughout Levinas's work, forgiveness is understood as a modality of temporality, from de l'existence à l'existant, also all the way to otherwise than being. And furthermore, which responsibility arises in and through this diachrony? Substitution as expiation, whose very kernel lies, as Levinas marks, in the one for the other as one hostage of the other, marks firstly how the self is substitutable for the other as radically unsubstitutable, unique, inimitable, and thus infinitely responsible for the other, where this responsibility is always and already inescapable, irremediable, irreversible. The self elected to responsibility, responsibility through substitution, responds for the other as hostage of the other, where no other can substitute oneself for myself. No other self can substitute itself for myself in my substitution for the other. So substitution presupposes the unsubstitutability of the self, which means substitution occurs through the absolute exposition of the self as singularly irreplaceable for the other. And thus substitution means the exposition of the self's election and singularity in responsibility for the other. Precisely where, and I quote, through substitution for others, the one self escapes relations. At the limit of passivity, the one self escapes passivity, or the inevitable limitation that the terms within relation undergo. In the incomparable relation of responsibility, the other no longer limits the same. It is supported by what it limits. Here, the overdetermination of the ontological categories is visible, which transforms them into ethical terms. In this most passive passivity, the self liberates itself ethically from every other and from itself. Before and beyond, its responsibility for the other, the proximity of the neighbor, does not signify a submission to the non-ego. It means an openness in which being's essence is surpassed in inspiration. It is an openness of which respiration is a modality or a foretaste, or more exactly, of which it retains the aftertaste. Outside of any mysticism in this respiration, the possibility of every sacrifice for the other, activity and passivity coincide. I close the quotation. Now, we shall approach what Levinas here calls sacrifice. It's a modality of substitution, and which he will mark as the very modality of the approach to the other. And here, just to mark that Levinas is thinking in Hebrew, the word for sacrifice in Hebrew means korban, or one of the words for sacrifice is korban, which also means approach. It's also the root of the word approach, to approach. Yeah? Um, and it's very interesting to see that in Otherwise in Being, every time Levinas talks about sacrifice, it's followed by the word approach, right? Approach um, of the other as in substitution as expiation. Sacrifice indeed will animate for Levinas substitution as expiation. But we quoted this passage firstly to indicate in which manner, through substitution, Levinas engages the self in responsibility before and beyond activity and passivity. And through this diachrony, responsibility beyond and before any relation between the self and the other. Otherwise said, substitution engages the singularity of the self as always and already singularly called and invested beyond and before its own self, as response before the other's commandment and beyond what such a commandment could command. The self responds before its own self, beyond itself, for the other, before the other, beyond the other. In this sense, when Levinas marks that substitution means to take the place of the other or to respond for the other in place of the other, he deploys how substitution engages the diachrony, where the self exceptionally and unescapably responds before itself and before hearing the commandment of the other, as already beyond that which the self can respond and beyond what the other could demand of the self. Incessant excess, infinitization of the infinite as responsibility through substitution, the ethical opens to that which, without place, without conciliation or reconciliation, exceedingly elects the self before the self and before the other, to respond beyond the self and beyond the other. Substitution here means not to take the place of the other, but it means to be engaged in this incessant excess in the response, démesure, yeah, where neither the self nor the other can rationalize responsibility. And of course, this diachrony of substitution, Levinas embodies it as expiation. Substitution as expiation translates thus the diachrony of the ethical, where the self always responds before its autonomy and before the commandment of the other, as already beyond its own capacities and beyond what could be demanded by the other. But why expiation? And in which sense is expiation here to be differentiated from forgiveness? Firstly, as expiation for Levinas never means pardon or forgiveness for a fault committed, a wrong cause of an injury enacted. Rather, for Levinas, substitution as expiation means to carry the other, right? To carry the other before and beyond oneself, as before and beyond the commandment of the other. To carry and thus support the other, expiate for the other, before the other, beyond the other, engages an incessance of forgiveness. An incessance of forgiveness, and indeed in this diachrony of the self lies a perpetual pleading of forgiveness. Forgive me for responding too late. Yeah. Forgive me for responding too late, always too late, precisely when responding before your call, before your commandment. But the extraordinary aspect here in Levinas's thinking is how and why expiation, whilst engaging an incessant plea of forgiveness, also and at the same time presupposes a forgiveness without conciliation, a forgiveness without reconciliation. Expiation, originary expiation, as Levinas says, means forgiveness without conciliation. Here's the logic of the without. Forgiveness without conciliation, without reconciliation. And thus, before and beyond the self, substitution as expiation engages a forgiveness as separation, a forgiveness where the trope of reconciliation or conciliation is severed, cut, disengaged, and where the self as a creature is already engaged to incessantly create what? Create an approach as responsibility for the other. This incessantly creative responsibility through its elected singularity, always awakened in a self as creature, and thus irreducible to an ego capable of grounding its action in the universality of its scope or breadth, or in the autonomous obedience of its posited moral law, repudiates any identification or transubstantification with the other. One for the other as one hostage of the other, substitution as expiation, elected singular response as infinite responsibility before and beyond the self, whilst also before and beyond the other, never means for Levinas, communion, community, conciliation or reconciliation, fusion, recognition, or identification. It means rather the incessance of a temporal interruption, incessant reiteration of separation by which and through which a forgiveness without reconciliation reveals itself. Substitution opens thus towards the incessance of an expiation for the other as the gift given each time singularly, and which, without conciliation or reconciliation between the self and the other, creates in and as history irreducible breaks and scansions, fissures and fractures through which a communication that is also a temporality of singular instance of mending, yeah, to mend the world, right, of mending are revealed. This is why Levinas calls on to another word to think this diachronical movement, this creation at the heart of one for the other as one hostage of the other, another word than empathy, sympathy, being with, another word which Levinas marks precisely when indicating the meaning of approaching the other and thus of communication with the other. What is this other word, which also expresses the fine risk, le beau risque? In French, beau risque means sacrifice. Le beau risque, of which Levinas says is always something to be taken in philosophy. I quote, communication is an adventure is an adventure of subjectivity. He also says of sacrifice, that is l'aventure humaine. Different from that which is dominated by the concern to recover itself, different from that of coinciding in consciousness, it will involve uncertainty. It is by virtue of its eidos possible only in sacrifice, says Levinas, which is the approach, so korban, of him for which one is responsible. Communication with the other can be transcendent only as dangerous life, donc le beau risque, a fine risk to be run. These words take on their strong sense when, instead of only designating the lack of certainty, they express the gratuity of sacrifice. In a fine risk to be run, the word fine, so beau, which is translated as fine, has not been thought about enough. It is as antithetical to certainty and indeed to consciousness that these terms take on their positive meaning, says Levinas. The gratuity of sacrifice has that fine risk which philosophy has yet to take and which otherwise in being or beyond essence has ventured into. And in order to rethink before and beyond recognition or community, the approach of the other in substitution as expiation for the other and through its diachrony engages yet a further movement in that it marks how and why substitution as expiation also involves and implicates a sacrificial movement which Levinas sustains throughout the writing of Otherwise in Being. Indeed, I quote, very beginning of Otherwise in Being, responsibility goes beyond being. In sincerity, in frankness, in the veracity of this saying, in the uncoveredness of suffering, being is altered. But this saying remains in its activity, a passivity, more passive than all passivity, for it is a, quote, I'm quoting, sacrifice without reserve, without holding back. And in this non-voluntary, the sacrifice of a hostage, designated who has not chosen himself to be hostage, but possibly elected by the good in an involuntary election not assumed by the elected one. For the good cannot enter into a present, nor be put into a representation. But being good, it redeems, so redemption, it redeems the violence of its alterity, even if the subject has to suffer through the augmentation of this ever more demanding violence. I close the quotation. Very famous passage, page 15, very beginning, Otherwise in Being. We are already hearing here the idea of redemption in this highly condensed passage. But what does Levinas understand here by the gratuity of sacrifice, sacrifice without reserve, this emphasis on sacrifice without holding back? Sacrifice means for Levinas approach of the other. It means approach with that through which the good can redeem violence. If we follow thus Levinas's substitution as expiation, which culminates in the idea of sacrifice as communication, and thus if we follow the diachronie, which we have deployed above in what we have termed a logic of the without, perhaps we are thus to understand the gratuity of sacrifice precisely not as that operation in which the self would negate and abnegate itself, transform, through its self-renunciation, its responsibility for the other in the unconcealment of its own most self as the heroic and sovereign gift of its own most self. In other words, and as he always allies sacrifice with inspiration, psychism, respiration, the gratuity of sacrifice engages, for Levinas, not the fulfillment of sacrifice, not the accomplishment of self-sacrifice for the other, and the disclosure and presentation of its gift, the representation and the performance of its givenness, of the performance of the givenness of the gift of the self as gift by the self. Rather, and perhaps this is the revelation, so second moment after creation, revelation which Levinas points towards. The gratuity of sacrifice means the interruption of sacrifice, the severance of sacrifice, where this interruption means to incessantly give more than giving oneself in sacrifice, to give more than giving oneself in sacrifice, and thus be elected to approach the other in a radical separation with the other, and where this approach in separation means the incessance of approaching the other more than what the fulfillment of sacrifice or self-sacrifice could signify or symbolize. In a certain sense, the embodiment of sacrifice and sacrifice would imply for Levinas an abnegation of responsibility. An abnegation of responsibility for the other in the representation of the accomplishment, in the consecrated and reduced meaning of the ethical to an economy, to a sed foreclosing its saying. Levinas's insistence on sacrifice for the other, the incessant and without reserve of sacrifice for the other, this always acute and active possibility of sacrifice as human adventure, as Levinas says, engages in order not to reduce the ethical itself, in order for the ethical to remain always reconducted to a saying awakening the said, a saying in the said, and indeed where occurs the promises of a redemption of the said from its self-inclusion, the reiteration of a suspension and interruption of sacrifice, where the suspension and interruption elects the self to an excess of approaching the other, an approach always approaching the other more than the self could ever express in the abnegation of a self-sacrifice. That is, approaching the singularity of the other. And that's the last point I'm going to finish on with the question of justice and singularity. The gratuity without reserve of sacrifice, this hyperbolical infinitization of sacrifice for the other, would render the incessance of an otherwise than sacrifice a without sacrifice, a without the realization of sacrifice, which would never translate itself into a beyond sacrifice, but rather would engage the incessance of a break of sacrifice in and through sacrifice. An incessant sacrifice of sacrifice, always exposing more and already repudiating its termination in an accomplished sacrifice or self-sacrifice, as if this accomplishment would only present itself as nothing less and nothing more self-containment, which Levinas also labels as hypocrisy. So an accomplished sacrifice would be the culmination of hypocrisy. In the sense that here I am for the other would also, before and beyond the self, mean a here I am in sacrifice as also interrupting and suspending the realization of this sacrifice, and where the incessance of sacrifice for the other would also, and at the same time, fracture its accomplishment in the approach as excess of responsibility for the other. We would deploy, and this is going to be the last element of my talk, we would here deploy this interruption and suspension of sacrifice, of self-sacrifice, in the without reserve and gratuity of sacrifice for the other through what Levinas calls testimony. Testimony for Levinas is irreducible, as we know, to the cognitive, to the experiential, or to the epistemic, to representation or presentation. Testimony is not the evidential mark or marker for or of truth. And I remind you here a phrase of totality and infinity: truth supposes or presupposes justice, right? Which here he maximizes through the question of witnessing. Witnessing is not witnessing a truth. It's not a marker of truth. As sincerity, witnessing opens to the incessant iteration of exposition for the other, which through this exposition of exposition also engages its interruption as justice, where Levinas is not thinking towards universality, but rather how and where singularity suspends and interrupts universality. The testimony of diachrony as before and beyond the self, responding before and beyond the other, incessantly approaching the other through eleity, as interruption of self-sacrifice for the other, and thus interruption of the face-to-face with the other as justice, approach of the third, always there in the face-to-face to guard and survey over sociality, but also to engage sociality in messianic hope, which for Levinas means prophecy, the event of interruption in and as redemption. So that's the last point. Redemption, through which, without sacrifice, emerges a thinking of singularity, each time suspending universality. We are thus suggesting that it is within the testimony of eleity without cognition or recognition of the infinite, before and beyond presentation or representation, is opened an exceptional exposition as subjection, which infinitely gives more than it can or could, and in the same movement surveys the interruption incessant of self-sacrifice as it marks justice for the other, and as Levinas never dissociates the singular idea of justice from plurality, justice for others in the event where the saying through the said incessantly interrupts the universal, precisely where responsibility engages singularity before and beyond universality. The promise of redemption in the said, always animated by an irreducible saying. I'm going to close with Levinas. It is in prophecy that the infinite escapes the objectification and thematization and of dialogue, and signifies as eleity in the third person. The thirdness is different from that of the third man. It is the third party that interrupts the face-to-face of a welcome of the other man, interrupts the proximity or approach of the neighbor. It is the third man with which justice begins. Thank you very much.